The storm had already taken her shoes, her shawl, and nearly her will to live, but Margaret Cole would not let it take her son. She stumbled into the light of a ranch house window with her newborn wrapped against her chest, blood still staining her skirts from a birth that had happened in a hay barn 3 days prior, and when the door opened to reveal a tall stranger with tired eyes and a rancher's hands, she said the only words she had left in her, "We have nowhere left." What happened next would change 2 broken lives forever. If you believe that kindness can save a soul, that faith can carry a person through the darkest storm, and that even the coldest heart can be warmed by mercy, I invite you to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe for more stories like this one. Now, let us step back into the autumn of 1878, into the high plains of Wyoming territory, where the wind carried both sorrow and salvation on the same breath. Margaret Cole had once been a preacher's daughter in Missouri, raised on scripture and soft hands, never imagining that life would drag her across half a continent chasing a husband's broken promises. Thomas Cole had been charming once, the kind of man who spoke of gold claims and cattle fortunes with such conviction that her father had wept with pride giving her away. But the West did not care for charm. It cared for grit, and Thomas had none. 2 years of failed claims, failed harvests, and failed courage had turned him bitter, and when Margaret told him she was carrying his child, he did not weep with joy as she had hoped. He left in the night with what little money they had, riding toward Montana and never looking back, leaving her alone in a rented room above a mercantile in a town too small to have a name worth remembering. She might have gone home to Missouri, but shame is a heavier burden than hunger, and Margaret could not bear to write her father and confess that his blessing had led her into ruin. So she stayed, working what jobs a woman alone could find, mending clothes, scrubbing floors, until her belly grew too large to hide and the townsfolk's whispers grew too loud to ignore. The landlord, a hard man named Rourke, put her out onto the street on a gray October morning, telling her plainly that a woman without a husband and soon without rent had no place in his building. She walked the frontier roads for 3 days after that, sleeping in a stranger's barn where her son was born alone, with only a lantern and her own trembling hands to bring him into the world. She named him Samuel, after the prophet, because she believed, even in her despair, that God still had ears for the desperate. It was hunger and cold that finally drove her to the gates of the Whitfield Ranch, the largest spread in 3 counties, owned by a man the whole territory spoke of with a strange mixture of awe and pity. Jonathan Whitfield was 34 years old, and he was, by any measure of the frontier, a millionaire, having built a cattle empire from nothing after the war, his herd stretching across thousands of acres, his name known in the stockyards of Chicago and the banks of Cheyenne alike. But wealth had not brought him peace. He had lost his wife and infant daughter to fever 4 years prior, and since then, the great house on the hill had become less a home and more a mausoleum of what might have been. He worked from dawn until his hands bled just to keep his mind from wandering to the nursery he had never let anyone touch, still painted soft yellow, still holding a cradle that had never been used a second time. It was into this house of quiet grief that Margaret Cole came stumbling on that storm-racked night, her son wrapped in a scrap of blanket, her feet bare and bleeding, her voice barely a whisper when Jonathan opened the door. "We have nowhere left," she said, and then her knees buckled, and only his quick hands kept her from falling onto the porch with the baby still in her arms. He did not hesitate, though every rational instinct of a cautious businessman might have told him to send for the sheriff or the church rather than take a stranger into his home. Something in her eyes, some echo of the exhaustion he had carried himself after his own loss, moved him beyond calculation. "Then you have me," he said quietly, lifting her as though she weighed nothing at all, carrying her and the child into the warmth of the house while thunder cracked over the plains behind them. For 3 days, Margaret drifted in and out of fever while the ranch's housekeeper, a stout, kind widow named Bertha Nolan, nursed her back to strength and fed baby Samuel with a mixture of goat's milk and prayer. Jonathan hovered at the edges of the sickroom more than a rancher of his standing should have, telling himself it was merely Christian duty, though Bertha noticed the way his eyes lingered, the way he asked after the child's health before his own breakfast each morning. When Margaret finally woke fully coherent, she found herself in a bed softer than any she had known since childhood, sunlight pouring through lace curtains, and a stranger's son sleeping in a cradle that clearly had not been touched in years, now filled with fresh linen someone had aired out just for him. She wept when she understood what had been given to her, not out of relief but out of a shame so deep it nearly swallowed her gratitude whole. She insisted she could not stay, that she had no way to repay such kindness, that a fallen woman and her fatherless child had no business under the roof of a respectable man. Jonathan, standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands like a boy called before a schoolmarm, told her plainly that respectability had never once fed a hungry child, and that he would not have her leave his house only to die on some frozen road so that gossiping women in town could sleep easier at night. "You'll stay," he said, "and you'll earn nothing you don't want to earn, but you'll not go back out into that storm while I've breath in my body to stop you." It was not romance, not yet, but it was the first stone laid in a foundation neither of them yet understood they were building. The weeks that followed unfolded slowly, the way frontier seasons always did, marked by chores and weather and the small rhythms of survival. Margaret found purpose in the ranch house, first helping Bertha with the cooking and mending, then gradually taking on the bookkeeping when Jonathan discovered, quite by accident, that she could read numbers as easily as scripture, a skill left over from helping her father manage church accounts. She was careful, precise, and unafraid to point out when a cattle buyer in Cheyenne was shorting him on a shipment, and Jonathan found himself relying on her judgment in ways he had not relied on anyone since his wife's passing. Samuel grew fat and healthy on the ranch's abundance, and it became a common sight to find Jonathan Whitfield, the richest man in the county, walking the porch at midnight with another man's infant son against his shoulder, humming some tuneless lullaby while Margaret slept the exhausted sleep of a mother finally unburdened. But peace on the frontier was never permanent, and trouble arrived that winter in the shape of Thomas Cole himself, gaunt and hollow-eyed, having failed in Montana just as he had failed everywhere else, riding into the county with rumors of his wife's whereabouts and a hunger for the fortune he imagined she might have found. He arrived at the Whitfield ranch on a bitter January afternoon, demanding to see his wife and child, his voice thick with the false righteousness of a man who believes abandonment can be forgiven by mere return. Margaret went pale as bone when Bertha announced him, and it was Jonathan who stepped onto the porch first, his frame filling the doorway like a wall between the storm and the house. Thomas tried charm first, the same charm that had once won a preacher's daughter, speaking of a husband's rights and a family's duty, but Jonathan's eyes were flint, and his voice, when it came, was low and unshakable. He told Thomas plainly that a man who abandons a woman with child in a strange territory forfeits any claim to call himself husband or father, that the law of decent men mattered more out here than the law written on paper, and that he would be wise to remount his horse and ride on before the ranch hands, who had grown fiercely protective of Margaret and the boy, decided to help him find the county line a good deal faster than he'd like. Thomas, for all his bluster, was a coward at heart, and cowards rarely stand long against men who are not bluffing. He spat curses, threatened to bring the sheriff, and rode off into the gray afternoon, though the threat of his return hung over the ranch like smoke that would not clear. It was Sheriff Amos Fielding, a fair and weathered lawman who had known Jonathan since before the war, who settled the matter for good some days later, riding out to the ranch to inform them that Thomas Cole had been arrested 2 counties over for horse theft, a crime that would keep him behind bars for years to come, having apparently decided that if he could not extort a fortune from his abandoned wife, he would simply steal one instead. Margaret received the news with a complicated grief, mourning not the loss of the man he might have been but the confirmation that he never would be, and Jonathan, watching her carefully in the parlor light, understood that she needed no rescuing from that particular sorrow, only the space to let it pass through her like weather. It was in the spring, when the ranch's pastures turned green and Samuel had grown strong enough to grip a finger with startling determination, that Jonathan finally spoke what had been building quietly in his chest since that first storm-soaked night. He found Margaret in the yellow nursery, rocking Samuel by the window, and he stood in the doorway for a long moment before speaking, his usual confidence, the confidence of a man who commanded thousands of acres and hundreds of cattle, entirely absent. He told her that he had built an empire out of stubbornness and grief, that he had believed happiness was a door closed to him after he buried his wife and daughter, and that somewhere between her fever-bright eyes on that first terrible night and the sound of Samuel's laughter filling a house that had been silent for years, he had begun to hope again, a feeling he had thought long dead in himself. Margaret, who had spent a year believing herself unworthy of any man's honest affection, wept before she could speak, and when she finally found her voice, she confessed that she had fallen in love with him somewhere in the quiet accumulation of small kindnesses, in the way he never once made her feel like a burden, in the way Samuel had begun reaching for him before he reached for anyone else. She told him she feared she had nothing left to offer a man of his standing, no dowry, no reputation, nothing but a fatherless child and a heart still healing from betrayal. Jonathan crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, taking her hand in his, and told her that she had offered him the only thing his fortune had never been able to buy, which was a reason to want tomorrow to come. They were married that June under the wide Wyoming sky, in a ceremony small enough to fit the whole of the ranch's hands and half the county's well-wishers on the front lawn, with Bertha weeping happy tears into her apron and Sheriff Fielding standing witness with his hat pressed to his chest. Samuel, not yet a year old, wore a tiny suit Bertha had sewn for the occasion and slept through most of the vows in his mother's arms, blissfully unaware that he was witnessing the moment his life changed forever, the moment he gained not just a stepfather but a man who would, in every way that mattered, become his true father. Jonathan legally adopted him within the year, giving him the Whitfield name, and there was not a soul in that county who ever again spoke of Samuel as anything but a Whitfield son, born of love if not of blood. The ranch prospered in the years that followed, not merely in cattle and land but in the immeasurable wealth of laughter that filled its halls, in the sound of children's feet on wooden floors, for Margaret and Jonathan were blessed with 2 more children in the years that came, a daughter they named Grace, in honor of the mercy that had brought them together, and a second son named Elias. The yellow nursery, once a shrine to grief, became instead a living room full of noise and joy, repainted and repurposed a dozen times over as each child grew into it and out of it, and Jonathan often told visitors, with a rare softness in his voice, that the room had taught him that grief and joy could occupy the same space, could even transform one into the other, if a person only had the courage to let mercy walk through the door. Margaret never forgot the woman she had been on that storm-soaked road, barefoot and broken, whispering words of despair to a stranger's window, and she made it her life's mission to ensure no other woman in that county would face such desperation without a helping hand. She and Jonathan opened the ranch's doors, quite literally, to widows and abandoned wives and orphaned children throughout the years, building a modest but sturdy boarding house on the edge of their land specifically for women in crisis, staffed by Bertha herself in her later years, funded entirely by Whitfield cattle money, and known throughout the territory simply as Grace House, a living testament to the night one man chose compassion over caution. Jonathan Whitfield, once known only as the richest and loneliest man in the county, came to be known instead as a man of deep and quiet faith, a man who understood that true wealth was measured not in cattle or gold but in the lives a person chose to lift up along the way. He lived to see Samuel grow into a fine young rancher in his own right, to see Grace marry a good and honest man from a neighboring spread, to see Elias take over the management of Grace House and expand its reach across 3 counties, and in his later years, he often sat on that same porch where he had once carried a fevered stranger into his home, watching his grandchildren play in the yard, and told anyone who would listen that the greatest decision of his life had been made in a single instant, in the space between a knock at the door and the choice of what kind of man he wanted to be. If this story moved something within you, I would love to hear from you now. Please take a moment to comment and tell me where in the world you are watching from tonight, and share with me what lesson this story stirred inside your heart, whether it was the power of kindness, the strength of faith, or the truth that even the darkest storm can lead us to the door where mercy is waiting. Your words mean more than you know, and I read every single one. And if this story of Margaret and Jonathan, of a desperate whisper answered by an open heart, touched something deep within you tonight, I ask you humbly to like this video, leave your thoughts in the comments, share it with someone who might need a reminder that they are never truly out of options, and subscribe so we can walk through more of these frontier tales of faith, sacrifice, and second chances together. For in the end, the wide plains of the Old West taught us something timeless, that even when the world tells us we have nowhere left to turn, mercy is often standing closer than we think, waiting only for us to knock upon its door.